to the next part of our program. At this point, I am happy and honored to introduce our keynote speaker. Ernesto M. Pernia is former Secretary of Socioeconomic Planning, National Economic and Development Authority, Philippines. He has been Professor Emeritus of Economics, University of the Philippines, since 2013, having been on the faculty of the UP School of Economics for several years. Earlier, Dr. Pernia was lead economist at the Asian Development Bank. His work experience included investment climate and productivity, economic growth and poverty reduction, education and health, population and development, and regional economic cooperation in Asia. He was also regional advisor on population employment policy for Asia and the Pacific with the International Labor Organization. Dr. Pernia has served as chair of the Board of Trustees of the University of San Carlos and as a director on the board of the Philippine-American Academy of Science and Engineering, or PAASE. He is also on the boards of NGOs involved in health, population, development concerns, and he is a former president of the Philippine Economic Society. Dr. Pernia obtained his PhD degree from the University of California, Berkeley, on a Ford Foundation scholarship and Smithsonian Institution dissertation grant. He received the first award as Outstanding Young Scientist in Economics and Social Sciences from the National Academy of Science and Technology. He was chosen by the PAASE for the 2015 Co-Science Lectureship Award and inducted into the PAASE Hall of Honor in April 2018. Dr. Pernia has authored several books and articles in national and international journals. He's a very, very high H index. He was an occasional contributor of public interest commentaries in various Philippine and some international dailies. Dr. Pernia was the principal author, architect, conceptualizer of the Philippine Development Plan 2016 to 2022 and the Philippine Medium-Term Plan, Ambition 2040, also of the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Plan of the country, which he charted before he resigned as NEDA Secretary on April 23, 2020. Please welcome Dr. Ernesto M. Pernia, whose talk is entitled Overcoming the Perfect Crisis Brought About by COVID-19. Dr. Pernia.
Oh, thank you, President of PAASE, Giselle Concepcion, for the introduction. Let me start with salutations. My heartiest and warmest greetings to the President of PAASE, Dr. Giselle Padilla Concepcion, high-spirited, energetic, whose energy runneth over. And of course, to the officers of PAASE, the board directors and members of PAASE, and our distinguished guests in this annual meeting of PAASE and Symposium. Thank you to the organizers of this APAMS, PAASE 40th anniversary, for giving me the singular honor of doing the keynote remarks. A popular saying was that life begins at 40. It's not being used anymore now because, but in the earlier generations, that was a popular phraseology. So perhaps this year marks PAASE's second life. The beginning of PAASE's truly pivotal, game-changing, and even life-changing and more palpable impact on the country's economy and society, underscored by our scientists and engineers' output, discoveries, and inventions that matter even more. Moreover, PAASE's 40th is a significant milestone, a watershed moment, perhaps for the start of a transition from this COVID pandemic to hopefully a new and better normal, as already mentioned by some of our earlier speakers like Chris Monterola. Let me, well, it feels rather strange that about this time last year, many of us in the dismal science, also known as economics, were taken by what was referred to then as the new globalization. The idea was globalization, as we knew it and were accustomed to, was undergoing radical transformation. Its main features besieged by increasing protectionism or neo-nationalism, not to mention trade wars between the largest economies of the world, and the diverging growth trajectories of emerging economies. Added to this is the acceleration of digital integration. These hurdles to the global economic relations spurred inventive ways of connecting for trade and investment purposes, which nations and firms must figure out and imbibe to be in step with the new global, for this upcoming new global game. Thus, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies picked Navigating the New Globalization, Local Actions for Global Challenges as the theme of its 5th Annual Public Policy Conference, held last September 2019. A very challenging subject indeed, as many observers had characterized the new globalization by descriptions like volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, VUCA. Little did we know, and unbeknownst to all and sundry, that our concern about the so-called new globalization was just a foreboding of the upcoming perfect crisis, what we have now, much more devastating than the profound structural change in economic globalization. For what can be more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous than the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic? Health and economy are intimately interactive, such that trying to get an optimal balance, an optimal trade-off of the extent and timing of interventions to each of these concerns has been a daunting challenge, to say the least.
Next slide, please.
So let me now go on to my PowerPoint. So I call it perfect crisis because it's a double-edged sword. Health and economy, which, as I've said earlier, is intimately interactive. Poor health adversely affects economic productivity, and bad economy hurts health through livelihoods and incomes. There's no choice for us but to protect both. So it's a question of priority of nature or priority of order in terms of interventions. In this coronavirus pandemic, health is given priority, but attention to the economy cannot lag too far behind. And I think that is the problem we're encountering now. To what extent can we continue the lockdown, the quarantine, making it more hard or loosening it up so that the economy can begin to breathe and be back on track? Next slide.
Next.
Next slide. So let me start with socioeconomic indicators. So I call these indicators the good and the bad.
Next slide, please.
Next slide, please. The real economic growth in between 2016 and 2019 averaged 6.6%, a rather outstanding performance in the country's contemporary economic history. And we were just lagging behind a little bit behind Vietnam, which has been the fastest growing ASEAN economy. In fact, the Philippine economy was poised to become an upper middle income country this year, 2020, if not for the outbreak of COVID-19. Headline inflation averaged only 3% between 2016 and 2019 versus our target range of 2 to 4% inflation rate. We had the lowest unemployment rate ever recorded in history, in the recent economic history of the country, at 5.3%, and underemployment at 14.8% achieved in January 2020. That was the last. That was the latest labor force survey before the crisis, the COVID pandemic crisis outbreak. We also achieved the lowest poverty incidence in 2018 at 16.6%, down from 23.3% in 2015, meaning that about 6 million Filipinos were lifted out of poverty. Next slide, please. Fiscal space, meaning our fiscal situation was at its best also. We had the highest revenue collection at more than 16%, and lowest debt to GDP ratio of 39.6%, compared to our worst debt to GDP ratio of about 75% in 2004-2005. We also got the highest ever credit rating by credit rating agencies like Moody's, S&P, Fitch Ratings, and also the Japanese rating agency that ranges between BBB+ to A-, which is among the shining achievements compared with other ASEAN countries. Then our infrastructure, massive infrastructure program spending, we called it Build, BBB, doubled to 4.5% relative to GDP, it doubled compared to the past 5 years and even earlier. So in other words, the government was really hell-bent on improving our creaky, our dilapidated infrastructure in the country. Next slide, please. But in the first quarter of 2020, our growth rate plummeted to negative 0.2% due to the Taal volcano eruption, followed by the COVID coronavirus outbreak. The second quarter growth rate, which will be made available by the first week of August, that's next month, is likely to be much deeper negative before possibly improving slowly in the second half of 2020. Full year growth rate in 2020 is expected to be between negative 3.5% and negative 6.5%. So it's this is going to be the first time we have this negative growth rate in the past 22 years. Next slide, please. Factory output or industrial production sharply contracted by negative 40% in May 2020 due to the enhanced community quarantine, and that's because the ECQ was imposed on the whole of Luzon, including Metro Manila, which accounts for 75% of the country's GDP, and also anemic global trade. Underemployment, merchandise exports also declined by negative 36% in May 2020 due to slump in global trade. And merchandise imports shrunk as well to negative 41% in May 2020 due to global supply chain disruptions. Next slide. And there was something. Anyway, the unemployment, because of the shrinking of the GDP in the first quarter, unemployment has hit 17.7%, equivalent to about between 7 and 8 million unemployed workers. So that's why I call this set of numbers regarding the economy really bad. After this, the story we had for the averages between 2016 and 2019. So let's move on to the next slide. So this anticipatory and forward planning, AFP, this is not Armed Forces of the Philippines, anticipatory and forward planning. This was officially approved, next slide, officially approved by the Interagency Task Force on COVID-19 in May 27, 2020, as proposed by NEDA to prepare for economic recovery and transition to possibly a new normal. And one of the main developments after this was the Bayanihan 1, to heal as one. And we also needed to plan how to transition from Bayanihan to heal as one to Bayanihan to recover better as one. This Bayanihan, as you already know, essentially provided the social amelioration program as assistance to low-income households. Next slide. But there were positive externalities to the Bayanihan. You know, Bayanihan is a very meaningful word. It's really a very rich Tagalog word, which I've not been used to because I am from the Visayas. But Bayanihan means a lot of things. It's empathy, selflessness, generosity, magnanimity, compassionate. So this word is really something that should guide all of us, especially our leaders in the government, in the public sector, and in the private sector. If we can only live by and work by this very beautiful word, Bayanihan, I think we can easily overcome our problems, this COVID crisis, maybe faster. So what happened because of this Bayanihan and because of the crisis was what economists call positive externalities. So elements of malasakit or solidarity came together with the private sector and civil society organizations' spontaneous magnanimity. Project Ugnayan Damayan. This was a collective effort of Caritas Manila, which is the church group, business, and civil society, responded in 48 hours to provide food and medical supplies. Funds and consumable goods and various health equipment and supplies, including quarantine facilities and testing centers, were made available. You know, we had a very low capacity for, taking care of COVID patients and also testing centers. And so these facilities were ramped up with the help of the private sector. So volunteerism of healthcare workers and other frontliners also became very visible during this crisis. Next slide. The above highlights a whole of society, or so-called bayanihan spirit effort. The government obviously cannot possibly do it alone, despite whatever assertions and claims the government may be making. Better coordination between government and the private sector efforts are needed so that the whole impact of the combined effort is greater. So let us not let the lessons of a perfect crisis go to waste. And Chris Monterola mentioned earlier this collaboration between government, private sector, and the academe. This is something that's also been developing more visibly and palpably. Like, for example, UP has been providing guidance to the DOH, Department of Health, in terms of the data regarding COVID, the new COVID cases and deaths and recoveries. And UP, the group in UP has actually been very helpful. They have been very accurate in their forecasts and in their reporting, much better than what the DOH has done. Next slide. For the country's development or nation building effort, synergistic public-private partnerships are called for, from development planning to formulating and implementing programs and projects. You know, we really need a more harmonious relationship between the public sector or the government and the private sector, rather than being an adversarial relationship, which, for example, came out or became visible in this tragic case of ABS-CBN. But let me not elaborate on that, because everybody knows that already. So efficient, effective, and self-sustaining partnerships require higher trust between the public sector and the private sector, and also the citizenry vis-a-vis government and the business sector. You know, compared with other countries, like especially the Scandinavian countries, we are really a low trust society. And that is something we have to work on. We have to be more trusting of our fellow men, and the public sector and the private sector have to be more trusting of each other, so that, you know, there's better cooperation. And, you know, that's how a country progresses. If there is adversarial relationship, then we have a problem. Then we are stuck in in some debates, and the country just cannot move on. Next slide. So the bayanihan, this AFP, Forward and Forward Planning. So the idea is to prepare from bayanihan to heal as one to bayanihan to recover as one. So there are three objectives of the AFP, Anticipatory and Forward Planning. We need to build confidence in the country's health system capacity. All levels of health personnel, equipment and supplies, and social infrastructure, meaning hospitals, health centers, testing centers, and so on, in the near term, and enhancing further over time to better prepare for the next possible health crisis. We have badly underinvested in health infrastructure vis-a-vis our ASEAN neighbors and taken for granted our healthcare personnel. Our healthcare personnel, medical doctors, nurses, they are really badly underpaid. And that is why they leave the country. So maybe if the government cannot afford to provide adequate compensation for healthcare personnel, if there is better partnership with the private sector, and I think mentioned also earlier, maybe the private sector can pitch in to improve the compensation of our healthcare personnel and prevent them from leaving the country. You know, the expression is health is wealth. We can also say the health is economy. There's a recent study by McKinsey which shows that investment in health of $1 could result in $2 to $4 multiplier effect on the economy. And that is because of fewer premature deaths. So the workforce is larger, higher labor productivity, lower absenteeism. Let me give you some numbers in terms of our spending on COVID-19. In terms of per capita spending, we are the lowest among the major ASEAN economies. We are only spending $195 US per person, compared with Vietnam spending $277 per person, Thailand $1,211, Malaysia $2,488 per person, Indonesia $237, that's the second lowest, and Singapore $16,331 US per person. In terms of relative to GDP, we are spending only 5.7% of GDP versus Vietnam's 10% spending on this COVID crisis relative to GDP. Thailand 16%, Malaysia 22%, Indonesia 6%, and Singapore 26%. So we have not only badly underinvested in our health system capacity, we continue to still spend. We have been a laggard in terms of spending on this health pandemic that we are facing, and that's because there's some obsession about keeping our high credit rating. Actually, because of our higher credit rating among credit rating agencies in the world, we should be able to borrow at easier, at lower rates than normal, than average for countries that are not that do not have as high credit rating as the Philippines has. So that if I were to decide, I would spend more, and never mind if we get a downgrade in our credit rating. It's more important that we address this health crisis and economic crisis frontally without further delay. So anyway, let's go back to this investment in health, which is very productive, which results in a very productive, very high multiplier on the economy. This slide, this graph here shows countries classified by level of income. So in the highest level of income, the multiplier is 3 times. In our case, maybe our type is the second from the left, the second cluster, and 2 times. The multiplier is twice, and for the lower income countries, 4 times, and for the lowest, about 2 times the multiplier of spending on health vis-a-vis the impact on the economy of those countries. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the next objective of AFP is to rebuild consumer and business confidence. This is a very important objective, because without consumers being confident to go out and spend and work, then the economy, the supply side, production cannot be stimulated. So it's really, it has to be a demand stimulus. That is the Keynesian approach to the economy during the Great Depression. The Keynesian approach was as demand stimulus, not supply stimulus. So what we need to, in terms of making or raising consumer confidence and business confidence, we need to ramp up testing, contact tracing, isolation, treatment to alleviate fear and worry and anxiety among the general public, consumers and workers and entrepreneurs. Because according to SWS survey, recent survey, 87% of the population say they are seriously concerned about COVID-19 contagion. So we need to revive consumer confidence. It is a sine qua non, because without consumer confidence, 70% of GDP, which is because our economy is consumption driven, is not it's not working. It's not contributing to GDP. So of course, with weak consumer spending from joblessness, it would keep our business and employment down, and hence our economy in the doldrums. And that is what's happening. And that is what that is why I said earlier, let us spend more. Let us spend to the extent that Vietnam, for example, is spending. And you know that Vietnam, I'm sure you know, it's a very widely known story that Vietnam has no COVID death at all, and very few cases. And also Thailand. Thailand has only about 58 deaths compared with our 1,700, I think now, 1,700. And their cases are only about 2,300, Thailand. And ironically, Thailand was the first to contract, the first country where a person contracted the pandemic or the coronavirus coming from Wuhan, and yet they were able to address it very quickly. So that is the thing. So let's move on. So there are proposed bills in Congress: Arise, Cures, and Create. Let me just say that Arise is geared to micro, small, and medium enterprises and jobs to promote consumer spending. And so it's essentially designed as for short to medium term sectoral and structural interventions. Cures is an unemployment reduction stimulus and it focuses on infrastructure for high multiplier effect on the economy. Create is more geared towards large corporations, and it's really more in terms of reducing the tax rates on large corporations. But it is really more for later, for the longer term. Next slide. Okay, and then, okay, rebuilding consumer confidence is very challenging as humanity crawls on the dark tunnel toward the end of the pandemic, which impacts the timeliness and efficacy of the economic stimulus, efficiency and effectiveness of lockdowns. I think you have seen the next slide. Maybe some of you have seen this. Next slide. Next one. Yeah, this one shows that.
Next slide.
Next slide. Yeah, on the lower quadrant to the left, that is low mobility, low recovery. And that is where the Philippines and Indonesia are. On the right-hand side, lower quadrant, it is low mobility, high recovery. On the upper right-hand corner, that is where Vietnam and Thailand are. High mobility, high recovery. And on the other side is high mobility, low recovery, and that is where Greece and Poland and Brazil are. So maybe we have overdone our lockdown. And what we really should have done more was the health interventions, this testing, tracing, contact tracing, isolation, and treatment, more than lockdowns. Lockdowns can lock down the economy and lock down society. Anyway, next slide. I think, okay. And then, of course, our third objective is to recommend policies and programs so that to the new normal. But the new normal is very uncertain, and it's the object of various speculations. So I'd rather go to the next slide. And next slide. The next slide is about there are positive ways of seeing COVID-19 crisis. As I've said, the bayanihan spirit should really be cultivated, and we hope it can be sustained and strengthened for future crises, which is needed to foster inclusivity and reduce inequality. I think if we have this bayanihan spirit really imbibed and part of our, it becomes second nature, then we should really be doing better as an economy and as a society. And then the critical importance of public-private partnerships, including the academe, as mentioned earlier, in addressing the problems and implementing PPP, physical and social infrastructure projects. This is something that the government has shunned, which was not my view. So anyway, let's go to the next slide. Greater public cognizance of S&T and innovation.
Back.
And this is where
back, or not, you're not controlling.
Yeah, and this is where PAASE is called to action. I think that's why I said earlier that this is the time that PAASE can make game-changing, life-changing impact on the Philippine economy and society. For example, there has been an acceleration of our adaptation to Industry 4.0, as evidenced by the use of digital technology. Now it's more widely used. And finally, my point is we need a culture of urgency, a sense of urgency. Filipinos tend to be too tolerant, too patient, too forbearing. Compared with our ASEAN neighbors, they have a higher sense of urgency. And I'm writing a book now, which is titled Virtuous Impatience. And I hope to get that out soon. And it's about, you know, how our country should really move on to a higher urgency country. Okay, next slide. This is the last slide now. Postlude. And all I'm saying here is, you know, the AFP, Anticipatory and Forward Planning, ties in well with the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022, which the objective of the plan was to lay the foundation for inclusive growth, a high-trust society, and a globally competitive knowledge economy. Again, something that PAASE should contribute to, a globally competitive knowledge economy. And these are the main pillars: malasakit, pagbabago, patuloy na pagunlad, strengthening the social fabric or solidarity, inequality reducing, transformation, and enhancing the economy's growth potential. And we also have the sub-pillars down there. Next slide. So with continuity of purpose through succeeding generations, or administrations rather, it should lead us to achieve our long-term vision of Ambition Natin 2040. So with that, let me end and thank again the organizers, President Giselle, for inviting me to do the keynote. I hope I was able to key in something. Thank you very much, President Concepcion, and to everybody here, Francis de los Reyes, of course, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pernia, for your thought-provoking presentation on the socioeconomic upturns from 2016 to 2019, then to the sudden dismal downturn in 2020, and then to a positive, anticipatory, and forward plan in response to crisis, rooted in individual virtues and the Filipino community values of bayanihan, on the creation of synergistic, trustful, private-public partnerships, and a major investment in securing a healthy, productive workforce. We are noting your call to action to PAASE, virtuous impatience, which I try to practice. We are deeply grateful to you, Dr. Pernia, for your outstanding service in government. Let us all give Dr. Pernia a virtual, rousing round of applause.